In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a zigzag twill bookmark. So let's get started. First things first, let's talk about everything you're going to need to make this bookmark. So first of all, you'll need some sort of frame loom. This is our bookmark / bracelet loom. You can find it on our website at spruceandlinen.com. It comes in this matte black and a frosted white. Next, we're going to be using 4/8 cotton warp string. The reason we're using 4/8 cotton instead of 8/8 cotton or 4/12 linen is because this is the thinnest of the warp strings that I typically use, and we want to reduce the bulk of a bookmark. I'm trying to make this so it doesn't hold the book open too much. We don't want to damage the book. And then the next thing you'll need is a medium weight yarn. Now in this video, I will be showing you 3 different medium weight yarns, and the fact that they're not all the same thickness. They're kind of close. So these are the 2 other medium weight yarns you'll see me use throughout this video. This is a dishcloth cotton yarn. You might find it as Loops and Threads Everyday Cotton or Bernat Handicrafter Cotton. This one is the thickest of the 3, as far as I can tell, and this is Briggs and Little Heritage yarn. And this last one is Lion brand Woolies. So this isn't the Woolies Thick and Quick, this is just the Wool-Ease. I will list everything in the description box below. I'm also going to be using this little 2-inch piece of cardstock for the bottom of my loom. It's not 100% necessary on such a small piece, but it is helpful. You'll also want some sort of tapestry needle, a weaving comb, and of course some scissors. And lastly, a small yarn needle for tucking in the ends. Then you're gonna go ahead and you're gonna download this pattern. I will leave the link for the pattern in the description box below, or you can find it again on our website at spruceandlinen.com. So I'm gonna briefly explain how my patterns work and how you can sort of read grid patterns for frame loom weaving. So in this pattern, you can see that it's just a grid. To read this grid for weaving, you're going to keep in mind that each of the columns represents 1 warp string and each of the rows represents 1 weft string. So we're going to be warping our loom and then adding the weft into that. We'll get more into how this pattern actually weaves and how to use it once we warp our looms. Now, if you have our Spruce and Linen bookmark / bracelet loom, you're gonna do this exactly the way that I'm doing it. This is a 5 ends per inch loom, and we're double warping it, which is going to give us 10 ends per inch. You can definitely do this, use these same materials with a 4 ends per inch loom. Your weaving is just going to be a little bit more loose. So just bear that in mind if you're doing this. You might want to use the thicker of the medium weight yarns for your weft. The first thing we're going to do is tie a loop in our warp string. So I'm just folding over a few inches here, and I'm going to tie an overhand knot just like this. And I want to create for this piece a really little loop, big enough that it'll go around the little peg, but small enough that we're not using up a bunch of length of the warp string. So just like that. Then I'm gonna go ahead and cut off some of this excess, leaving about a 1/2 inch, just because it's gonna get in the way and we don't want that. Then I'm taking that loop, putting it around the first peg on my loom, and I'm gonna go up to the first space at the top. I'm wrapping it around the peg only, not all the way around the loom. And then I'm gonna come back down and I'm actually gonna go back into this first groove. This isn't normally how I would do this, but because we're fitting in 21 whole warp strings on this small loom, this is the way that you will have to do this. So we're going into that first groove, around the peg, into the next groove, and then we're coming back up and going into that second groove again. Now from here on out, we're just making sure that there are 2 strings between each of the little pegs, notches, basically in each space. Make sure there are 2 warp strings. So we're doing that all the way across our loom. Now I'm not pulling too tight on this. We don't want our warps super tight. We don't want them super loose. The tension that you need for weaving projects is something that will sort of come with trial and error, but just know that I'm not letting it be super loose, and I'm not pulling super tight. So this is kind of what the tension looks like. We're gonna come back down here. Now that we're at the very end, and we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. We have 20 strings on the loom, but we need 21. So we're gonna come back down to the second notch from the end, go around the peg, and then come back up to here. Then you're gonna wrap that around this little peg here. We're gonna leave a nice long tail. We're gonna cut the excess off later anyway, so give yourself a lot to work with. Now then, what I like to do, just because it feels best to me, is I flip around the loom, and then I'm gonna wrap my string around this very last string, and then back through this loop. It's a little bit awkward with one hand. We wanna make sure that that last string is tight enough. And don't worry about how it's crossing over here. It's fine. So I'm gonna pull that, trying not to ream on it too hard, but I do wanna make sure that it's tight. And then I'm gonna go under it again. And then that's gonna create a knot. And then just for safety, as always, I'm gonna do a triple knot. And then I'm gonna go ahead and again, cut off the excess, oops, leaving 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, just enough that it's not gonna get tangled up in the other yarn that I'm using. Now we're going to flip over the loom and grab some painter's tape. If you're working on a really small loom like this and you don't mind working flat on your table, I really recommend using some painter's tape to hold down your loom so that it doesn't move around on you. It's so much easier. I've even tried little rubber bumpers, but I've come to just appreciate the tape and the fact that it doesn't move at all on me when I use tape. So I'm just kind of rolling up small pieces of this painter's tape. Now, if you would prefer to weave something like this with your loom elevated at an angle, what you can do is, if you have a painter's easel, you can actually get a little piece of wood that's a bit bigger than your loom, and then you could just tape your loom to that piece of wood, put the wood in your easel, and weave like that if you like. Alternatively, you could always also just sort of prop it up on a book, but it will shift around a little bit more that way. All right, so I'm gonna stick this down to my table, and see, now it's not gonna shift on me. And because I used painter's tape, it's also not going to wreck my tabletop either. Now we're gonna take our cardstock. This one is folded over once. For such a small project, it doesn't necessarily have to be folded over, but the fold itself provides some extra strength, so I like it. And I'm gonna just weave this in under one, over one. So it's just plain weave. And the reason I'm going under first is because my first row of weaving, I wanna go over, so the opposite of what I'm doing this cardstock. And so that's just going to make it a little bit easier. So I need to keep in mind which is the last string, since there's a little bit of crossover here. And I know it's this one because down here you can see that. So I'm going over, under, over, and then under. And I'm just wanting to push that all the way down to the bottom of my loom. Next, I'm grabbing my weft yarn. Now I have woven a couple in advance. I kind of figured out how much yarn to use for the other two yarns. And what I've found is that you're gonna need approximately 180 inches, but it depends on how thick your yarn is. So I will use approximately 180 inches, and then I'll let you know how much I have left. So if you want a more exact measurement because you're going to use this exact yarn, you will. But for me, my arm span, when I don't have my fingers fully stretched out, is about 60 inches. So I'm going to be taking 3 arms lengths of this yarn, and that's gonna get me the whole bookmark. So I won't need to start and stop a new, or stop and start a new piece of yarn. So I'm threading this into my tapestry needle now. So before we start weaving the actual pattern, I'm gonna go ahead and do my twining stitch. So I'm going to weave in over one, under one. I like starting on the right. I think it's because I'm right-handed, and for some reason I like doing my twining stitch with my left hand. I'm not really sure why, it's just the way that it is. So I just wove this in over one, under one. So just a standard plain weave. And we do have a more extensive tutorial on twining that I can put right here, but I will give you a brief tutorial on twining. So I'm pushing that row down to the bottom. I've left a nice long tail, about 4 or 5 inches long. And now everywhere the weft, so that's the yellow, goes over top the warp, we're going to make a stitch. So the way that I'm gonna do this is I'm pointing my needle down at an angle from left to right. And I'm grabbing both the warp string and the weft string. So the weft is going over the warp, so we're making a stitch there. And yes, this length of yarn is a lot to work with all at once on such a small loom, but I like tucking in less ends, so that's why I chose to do that. So I'm gonna push this down a little bit more. Now we're skipping the next string because the next string, the weft is going underneath the warp. So we can skip that one and go to the next one where the weft is going over the warp, like so. We're grabbing both of those, and that's another stitch. And then we're gonna go ahead and make sure that we're tightening this as we go, because what this stitch is gonna do is sort of lock those warp strings into place better, and it just makes it so much easier when you take the piece off the loom as well. So we can skip the next one and go to the one after that, grabbing the warp and the weft, and I'm gonna do that same process all the way across my loom. Okay, so now that I have my twining stitch all in, I'm just gonna push all of this down firm against this cardstock at the bottom. And now we can get started with weaving our first row of the pattern. So I'm gonna grab this pattern. Again, I'm covering up all the other rows so that I can just focus on this row. So we're covering this up. One gray block represents going over one warp string. One white block represents going under one warp string. So since we have 2 gray in a row, we're going to start with going over 2, under 2, over 1, 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 under 2, and then over 2. Now again, we're going to continue getting this little twist in here because of the way that everything is tied at the bottom. And I could have probably found a different way to tie this, but just keep checking to the bottom of your loom to make sure that you're grabbing the right string. So I'm gonna make sure I have this habit, and I try to always verbalize these things, and sometimes I forget, but what I do is I kind of hold on to this far warp string with my fingernail or just with your finger, whatever works, and I sort of pull tight on the weft so that it's sitting snug against the warp string itself, but I'm not pulling it in. So I'm kind of keeping the warp string in place with my finger here. Then I'm gonna create a little arch. It's a little weaving, so we only need a little arch. I can strum the warp strings and then push down that first row of weaving. Now, something to keep in mind with a twill is that you don't want to ream down on the rows, or you're gonna really compact your pattern and it's not gonna look the same. We want to stack the rows on top of each other so that they are touching, but we don't wanna really ream down on them and squish the yarn really tight. So now we're going to go ahead and move this up to the next row. Now, if it helps you, you can go ahead and have a third piece so that you're covering up the other row. If that's helpful for you, go for it. And you can kind of just remember what row you're on. So we're on row 2. Now we're starting from left to right. So we're gonna go under 1, over 2, and then this row's pretty easy. Then we're going under 3, over 3, under 3, over 3, under 3, over 2, under 1. And we're gonna pull all that slack through. Once again, I'm holding on to the far warp string, letting the yarn go fairly snug against that far warp string, creating my arch, strumming the warp, and then pushing down the weft with my comb. And again, not pushing down really tightly, just so that the rows are stacked on top of each other. If you're finding this yarn is getting in your way, you can just sort of tuck it under your cardstock. Now we can move up to row 3. So again, I'm working from right to left this time, but every row is symmetrical. So you can still use these verbal instructions, whether you're going from right to left or left to right. All right, so we're going to go over 1, under 1, over 2, under 1. Now you can start to see the repeat. We have over 2, under 1, 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 over 1. Pull the slack through, snug it up on the side while holding onto that string, create your arch, strum your warp, and push down the weft. Now we're moving up to row 4. This row is the easiest one of them all because it's just alternating under and over 3 warp strings. So I'm going under 3, over 3, under 3, over 3, under 3, over 3, under 3. Hanging onto that far warp string, creating my arch, strumming my warp, pushing down my weft. So now you can see that first zigzag. Now here's where the pattern starts to repeat. After row 4, we can just go back to row 1. So you'll start to become more familiar with the rows as you weave them. Because there's only 4, you'll start to recognize the pattern itself. But if you would like to continue following with my verbal instructions, you can go back to this timestamp here. Now, we don't want to weave all the way to the top because we're going to be knotting the warp strings. I've heard from a lot of you of being really nervous about just having a twining stitch at the bottom and wanting to have actual knots so that you're feeling like the weaving is really secure. And I hear you. I do have bookmarks that only have the twining stitch, and depending on the yarns, I think it'll stay just fine. But if you are worried about it, today we're going to be doing the knots. And so we need to leave enough length at the end that we'll be able to tie those knots. I'm going to be weaving this a max of 5 inches, but it'll just depend on where my pattern is, because however long you weave this, you want to end on row 1, because row 1 is where we started, and it's going to make the piece symmetrical and finish off the pattern so you don't have sort of a half zigzag on your bookmark. All right, I'm gonna go back to row 1, keep weaving, and I will meet you at the top. So I've woven, I'll measure it for you. It's about 4 3/4 inches. So I wanted to stay between that 4.5 to 5 inches long so that I have enough room to tie my knots at each end. So I finished off with row 1, because remembering that after you weave row 4, as you're going up, you're gonna wanna go back to that row 1 so that your piece is kind of symmetrical. So basically what I mean by that, so row 5 on this pattern is the same as row 1, and you can see that by weaving that one again, we get the whole zigzag, whereas if we stop at 4, we're cutting off the zigzag before it gets to the actual point. So by going back to row 1, which subsequently is the same as what would be row 5, we're getting that whole zigzag. So now what I need to do is I need to go ahead and weave another twining stitch. Now there's 2 different ways you can do this. I have discovered that you don't necessarily have to cut a new piece to do your twining stitch, but you have to be careful not to pull in the strings if you're gonna do it that way. So I'm gonna do it that way so that I don't have more strings to tuck in. So I finish off my row 1. Now I'm going to go back in with plain weave. And this time I am going from left to right because that's just where I had ended up. So we're just doing the under 1 over 1 plain weave. Now this time what I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna pull that tight. I wanna leave myself a little bit of slack to work with as I do my twining stitch, and I'm just gonna turn around and do that. So I'm skipping the first one because the weft is going under the warp, and I'm going to the next one where the weft is going over the warp. Now, I'm also gonna switch to a smaller needle for this part, simply because we're getting into like tighter spaces now, so it's just gonna be a little bit easier. So I'm using this yarn needle. You can use a plastic yarn needle as well. You can usually find these anywhere that sells yarn. So I'm skipping the first one, going to the one after that. And this time, since I'm working from right to left, I'm pointing my needle down with the top further off to the right and the bottom further off to the left. So I'm grabbing that and I'm gonna pull this so that it's snug at the end of my warp string, and then I'm gonna pull the other one this way. So I'm having a little bit of slack here. Skipping the one after that, going to the next one where the weft goes over the warp and making another stitch, and then pulling the excess off to the left. Like, hopefully I don't have too much. I don't want to go too crazy with that, but I do want to leave myself enough slack that it's not going to get really tight on me. So I'm just going to continue that twining stitch all the way across, and I'm finding I don't necessarily have to pull each stitch really tight. This will still do what it needs to do, which is to keep the warp strings in place as we tie in the knots. So now I can see it's getting a little tighter. So I'm gonna pull on that string that's already woven in there. And then all we're gonna do, you can see that my twining stitch got a little bit crooked, so we just wanna straighten that out. I just like to eyeball it, but you can measure from each side to make sure that it's straight. That's looking great to me there. Now what we can do, I'm actually gonna keep my needle on this yarn, but I'm gonna slip it closer to the weaving and then cut off some of this excess. And now I can measure this, so I can tell you approximately how much yarn I actually used to weave this bookmark. So I'm left with, if I stretch it out a little bit, we'll say about 30 inches left, and I got 180 when I grabbed it. So in reality, I actually used approximately 150 inches, which is, let's do yards. About, we'll say 4¼ yards. It's a little bit less than that, but if you're trying to use up scraps for a piece like this, that's what you're going to need. I think doing the inches is probably a little easier. So if you're using this yarn, you're gonna need 150 inches. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll take out the cardstock here. We're going to pick up the loom. We can get rid of the tape, or if you're making more mug rugs, you can try to save this tape if it's not too filled with little yarn lints. And we're gonna flip over the loom. I have my yarn on the yarn needle and I need to stitch this end back in. So first I'm gonna go in just to this first warp string here. I'm gonna grab that. And I don't wanna pull too tight, but I want it to be straight with the edge of my weaving. Then I'm gonna go over here and we're actually gonna go through the channel of warp strings on the back, because on the front, that same channel is weft strings, and so it's gonna hide this a little bit better. So I'm gonna grab these warp strings, trying not to grab the weft. So you can see where I have my needle here, and if I flip over my loom, you won't really see it. It's going through this channel here. So you shouldn't see it very much once I pull that through. Now you don't want to ream on that. And if I flip it over, you can kind of tell that it's in here, but that's going to be as hidden as we can get this. And when you look at the whole piece, you really can't tell. And that's only a few strings, so I'm actually going to go back down this way. So I've grabbed a few more of those warp strings in the back. And again, I really don't want to pull tight on this. And then I'm gonna go ahead and trim off the excess, just like that. So then down here, I'm gonna do the exact same thing. So I'm gonna grab a few of these warp strings, again, only grabbing the warp strings. So you can always flip it over and check that you're going through this channel and you're not seeing the needle from the front. And then grab a few more warp strings. And we can flip it over, double check that it's looking pretty good there, and then trim off the excess. So now we're ready to get the bookmark off of our looms. Hopefully your weaving isn't too tight on your loom so that you can actually slip it off, but if it's feeling really, really tight, you can also cut your bookmark off of the loom. But I'm gonna go ahead and slip this off mine because I can feel that there's enough slack. So what I like to do is sort of grab the warp strings and pull them towards the first peg, and then it sort of comes off a little bit easier. But again, if your piece is really tight on your loom, you wanna be careful to not try too hard to do it the way I am, because it could break one of your little pegs or notches or whatever you want to call them. All right, so I've got it off one end. I'm going to slip it off the other end. And now we're left with this. Grab a brick or a couple of books. Brick. So now I'm grabbing a couple of books, and this is going to weigh down the bookmark as I'm tying the knots. It makes it much easier so the bookmark's not flying all over the place. Since we have an odd amount of warp strings on each end, we're gonna have one grouping of 3, but the rest will be 2. So I'm grabbing the end with the little loop and the 2 strings after that, and I'm going to tie an overhand knot. And I'm gonna push that knot so that it's touching that twining stitch without reaming on those strings. We don't want to misshapen our bookmark. We're just pushing that knot so that it's touching the twining stitch. So that's our first knot. Then we're grabbing the next loop, which is 2 warp strings, and we're doing another overhand knot, same thing, up to the twining stitch without hopefully pulling it too tight. So I'm gonna do that all the way across the piece, and then I'll do the same thing on the other side. All right, this bookmark is almost done, but we need to do a couple more steps, and we're not gonna completely finish it till the very end of this video because I'm also going to be weaving 2 more bookmarks with different yarns so that we can kind of compare at the end. But one of the other steps we have to do to finish this is we're gonna cut off the fringe. You can cut this as short or as long as you like. I'm gonna go for about an inch. Maybe that's more like 3/4 of an inch. Yeah, it's a little less than 1 inch. And I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. You can always measure if you don't want to eyeball it. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a rope brush that looks like this one. This particular one is from Unfettered Co. And then I'm going to just gently brush out the warp strings so that they're a little bit more floofy. Now this is sticking out weird, and I'm hoping I have a solution for that again we'll do at the very end. But we're just kind of brushing out the plies of the string so that it looks a little bit more full. Now you might find that after you comb out that fringe that you might need to trim it up again a little bit more. And we're just gonna set this aside. We're going to be flattening this out later. For the second bookmark, I'm using this light pink 4/8 warp string and this light blue dishcloth cotton. This particular one is Loops and Threads Everyday Cotton. I'm starting this bookmark the exact same way I did the first one. So I'm doing that twining stitch, and then I'm starting the pattern and repeating it until I reach 4.5 to 5 inches long, finishing it off with a twining stitch, and then doing the ends exactly how I did the first one. For the last bookmark, I'm going to be using 4/8 cotton again, but in this rusty brown color, and I'm using Briggs & Little Heritage yarn for the weft. This is the thickest of the yarns, I believe, and it is a much stiffer wool yarn than the Lion brand woolies. Now for this one, I wanted to try something different just to see how it would go, and instead of starting with a twining stitch, I just did 2 rows of plain weave, and then I wove up my pattern and ended with 2 more rows of plain weave. I knotted up the ends, but as you can see, it was a little bit of a struggle to do those knots with just the plain weave, and I do really prefer having that twining stitch in because it just secures the warp strings so that you don't have to kind of reshape the weft once you get the bookmark off of the loom. All right, so now we have all 3 of our bookmarks, and we are gonna go ahead and iron these so that they sit a little flatter. Now, we can notice right away that while the plain weave on this one was a little bit more annoying to do the knots, it is the one that is sitting the flattest. So I guess there's something to be said about that. This one is a little bit better than this one, and this one's sitting a little bit wonky, but I'm hoping the ironing is going to fix that. So I'm gonna go ahead and heat up my iron, and we will press these. So for the 2 more wool blend yarns, I needed about 150 inches of weft yarn to do the bookmark, but for the dishcloth cotton, I needed closer to 160 inches. So just keep that in mind depending on the yarn that you're using. It might just be best to go with that full 180 inches, knowing that you'll for sure have enough if you do that. All right, so let's grab our bookmarks. Now cotton, I'm not gonna wreck with this iron, but what I'm gonna do, I'm not gonna really slide my iron across the bookmark because I don't wanna snag on any of those wefts. So instead, I'm just sort of pressing it. So just letting my iron sit on top of it for a few seconds and just pushing down. And you can see that that's already really helping everything sit a bit flatter and nicer. So it's a little bit like what blocking would do. And you can even use a little bit of steam if you want. And it just sort of sets this in nicely, and it also helps flatten the bookmark, which is ideal. So there's the first one flattened. And now let's go to the next one. So the next one is 100% wool. So I want to be careful because it is surprisingly easy to over iron wool. So I'm being pretty quick when I set my iron on there. I can go a little bit more on the warp string because it is cotton. And I will at the very end clean up these warp strings if they were looking a bit uneven. See, that's looking a little bit flatter. And finally, let's see what we can do with this one. This one is sitting pretty wonky, and that was likely my own fault for getting maybe the tension a little bit off. But you can see that ironing that is definitely helping. I'm gonna go a little bit more on the actual warp strings, but that made a huge difference to how it's sitting. It was sitting so crooked before, and now that I've ironed it, it's looking a lot flatter. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and clean these up a little bit more on the ends, and then we'll have a look at the finished bookmarks. All right, they're all done, so let's have a look at the finished bookmarks. I want to know in the comments down below which one of these bookmarks is your favorite. Is it the white and mustard, the pink and blue, or the rust and dark teal? If you enjoyed weaving this pattern, check out our weaving pattern playlist right here.